Multitasking is a lie, and I'm going to prove it to you. Studies have been done for when people try to pay attention to two things at the same time. Our brain can operate similar to a computer in that there's a limited real-time processing capacity. Think of having too many browsers open. It's kind of an old model, right? Computers can handle that now. But now imagine you're also downloading a new game or a movie, and you have your favorite song playing in the background, while you're on a video chat calling your sister or your mom who's across the country. Oh, and by the way, ChatGPT is also finishing up generating your dissertation. I'm betting your computer is stretched a little bit thin. This creates what's called a cognitive load, or more simply, it's the amount of energy in our brain that it's using to try and accomplish multiple tasks at the same time. So our brain works the same way, except it's not as efficient as a computer. We cannot do all of those processing activities at one time. We actually have to switch back and forth from one focal point to another in a process that's called task switching. And this is incredibly inefficient, as we can't receive the full amount of information or data in order to process it from either one of these attention-demanding tasks. Or, more to the point of this episode, people. This results in significantly decreased performance. I'm sure you have all experienced this in some way, shape, or form, both as the sender and the receiver of information. I actually forgot to turn off a podcast that was playing as I began to outline today's episode. And while I worked through all of the different structural parts of what we're going to talk about today, I missed approximately 97.3% of what was said in the podcast. So I can confirm this because I rewound it. How old school is that? I rewound. It's half the people are like, what do you mean rewind? I went back earlier in the episode and I re-listened only to discover that, I didn't remember anything except for kind of loud reactions, like laughter, and maybe a couple of the words or things that were said right after that. But that was it. Now imagine what happens in a workplace. Let's say someone steps into your office and they're seeking your advice on a situation with a client. At the same time, you're responding to a pretty important email, and you also don't want to tell them necessarily, hold on, wait, I'll talk to you in a second. But you also don't want to lose your train of thought in what you're doing. So you just tell them, go ahead, I'm listening. As you continue to type, you're trying to process what it is that they're saying. Imagine the amount of information that you're going to miss from this person about the situation, about the client, and it's ultimately going to result in you having to ask them to, hey, could you tell me that again? One more time, run it past me. I didn't catch it. And they knew you weren't listening, but they felt compelled to speak anyway, as per your direction. Don't forget to go back and proofread that email because it's also pretty likely to be a hot mess at this point. At any rate, today we're going to dive into effective listening. We'll start off with understanding the different listening contexts and what they mean and how they actually impact communication from both sides, the sender and the receiver, the speaker and the audience. Then we're going to break down the exact measures you must take in order to listen effectively. We'll end with some secret sauce of how to listen when you're speaking. Counterintuitive, right? We kind of just said you can't really do it, but there are certain circumstances where this comes into play and it's very helpful. All right, let's roll up our sleeves and dive in. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do, we're going to try to understand the different contexts that exists for both you and your audience. We're going to think about their goals and your goals, both you as a receiver. Think about you in these situations from both the perspective of you being on the receiving side of information, and also you can take these into consideration when you're delivering information. So all of these go both ways. Number one, the first major context of listening is called informational listening. The audience is there to learn from you, or, you're there to learn from them. And the different kind of examples, imagine when you were in school. You're in the classroom, you have the teacher in the front, You're in a seat, you're in receive mode, they're in send mode. This is an informational context. Also consider kind of more things that we might be dealing with on a regular basis, something like conferences, public speaking events when you're in the audience and you're listening, or when you're speaking, like I said, flip both sides. And then there's also webinars. I actually had a really fun webinar that I gave for the Small Business Development Center regarding gratitude. And in the presenter mode, you can't see everyone that's attending, but I could see my partner in crime who was helping. She was like moderating the group as I was presenting. And so I could see her video, and that was it. And so I used her reactions as a cue for when things were landing or not. It's something that we're going to dive into a little bit later. You can also think about like right now, right here, podcast, right? You are listening, right? You're here, you're receiving, and I'm sending. It's a little bit different because there's not really room for that interaction. We are separated a little bit too far, too many levels apart for an interaction to take place. But this could be something like even like live podcasts when you're actually there attending live, similar to a webinar. Number 2, the second kind of context is critical listening, right? And so this is when we as the audience are understanding that there's persuasion afoot. Someone's trying to convince us of something, and so we have to be able to measure to what degree can we trust this person. For instance, when you have a new leader, somebody that gets promoted, someone that's brought in to take over a managerial position, you get promoted and moved and like transferred to a different satellite location. As being new to the organization, especially if you're in a position of leadership, people are going to be trying to influence your views on things. Some things we just want to be aware of, paying attention to the sender's competence. And the kind of ways that we look at this, just generally speaking, is we want to see what is the depth of their knowledge on the subject that they're talking about. This might be more relevant to somebody who's up on stage speaking and maybe trying to sell your organization on their services or on an idea. So you want to see how deep does their knowledge go? Is it just a bunch of surface points? Are we just touching wave tops? Are we actually diving into the details? Are we getting tactical? What difference is this actually going to make? Do they know what they're talking about? They also will have good use of evidence. They won't just have a deep understanding of the process, but they're going to have evidence, and the evidence is going to be good. And the way that you can kind of measure if it's good is that if the presenter is able to effectively present both sides, then that is a huge trust builder. And that's another point for us to remember, that this isn't just for us necessarily as an audience. Think about this as you presenting. If you're presenting on behalf of your organization, you want to have that depth of knowledge, right? You want to have good use of evidence, and you want to be able to present both sides. Give a compelling case for when this doesn't work, or who your product or who your service is not for. That's critical, because it's great because you are eliminating people that are not going to be a good fit for you. If you're being true and honest about it, you're going to be eliminating organizations, groups that aren't a fit for you. And by doing that, people are like, oh, they see you cutting off your own legs, like cutting yourself off at the knees. And that is that kind of vulnerability, or that kind of, clarity, and it just instills honesty and trust with you and the receiver. So it's something that you can look for trust again from the other side. But you have to pay attention, because people can play games. People can play games with that. So it's a point. If someone doesn't bring it up, then it's something to think about, to ask. But if they do bring it up, like, oh, well, you brought it up on your own, and then you might want to still ask, dive a little bit deeper, like understand who's actually there, right? If you're at a particular kind of conference and there's only businesses maybe from the tech sector, and the person says, they're like, well, this really isn't good for schools. And you're like, oh, well, okay. We're all in tech. Like if you said that a certain kind of tech organizations or a certain department within tech in the tech industry or whatever, something specific to the people that are there, that's where you build the trust. If you do it from an outside perspective, then it's not necessarily as strong in the trust building of the relationship between the people. We also want to look at somebody's character, right? And it's hard to do in a confined space, in the speaker kind of situation, but you can look at, it's the perception of trust, which we just talked about a lot in the last one. So did they do that? Did they take steps to build trust? Did it look like they were making fair arguments, or were they being one-sided or, kind of underhanded, all of those things, honesty, all of it. It's those all go to character, but one of the most important parts is where are they placing their focus? This can go back into the kind of leader, first line supervisor and employee relationship, because one of the critical parts of character is identifying when somebody is prioritizing the needs of the audience. So when I say audience here, a lot of times you can kind of mix and match whether, it's a single person or it's like a larger audience. It's frequently the same thing. But when somebody's prioritizing the needs of the audience, even if it's just that one person, you're prioritizing their needs, that means a lot. And that shows character, because you're not making it about yourself. You're actually tuning yourself into this person's wavelength and receiving what they have to send, and then you're running it through those critical lenses. But you're giving them a shot, and that's a sign of character. And the last one here that we want to look at from a critical perspective, or the critical listening, is charisma from a receiver's end, and then from what you want to present as a sender or a speaker, is you want to have, admirable traits, respectable traits. Do you have some charm, and it's these things matter. And by charm, it's kind of appeals to emotions, like on a real level. Like, are you tapped in to understand what it is that they're feeling and how it is that your communication is impacting the feeling? That leads us directly into context number 3, which is empathic listening. The goal here with empathic listening is for the receiver to, be receiving, go figure, it's what a receiver does, is to be absorbing that information, that data that the speaker is sending. The next step is to help them cope with or solve a problem, right? These are the contexts of listening. These are like 3 main contexts in which we're engaging with people, and that we need to keep in mind for the next steps that we're about to get into of how to actually effectively communicate. But when we're looking at empathic listening, the first thing that you have to consider in this context of listening is seeking to understand the needs of the speaker. In this situation, there's a goal. Like, your goal is to communicate effectively, to listen effectively to a person who is struggling with something. Like, they're confiding in you would be the context here. A colleague comes into your office who's very upset about a deal that just happened with a client, or a sale that just didn't go through, or maybe one of your subordinates is struggling with things at home, and you kind of see this, and maybe they even approach you and kind of bring it up. Rather than just ignoring it and just being like, oh, that's not fun, you'll be all right. Like, we're engaging in this way. And one of the first things that you want to do here, though, is if somebody is approaching you and they are opening up about a problem, professionally, personally, doesn't matter, you want to seek to understand the needs of the speaker. In order to do this, you want to ask questions. And the type of questions that you might ask are, do you want my input on this, or do you just want to vent? That's a completely acceptable thing to say. I actually say it. My wife and I will say it to each other all the time, and I'll say it to people at work if the situation arises. If someone's very frustrated about something and they come in and they're blood pressure's risen, and they're kind of pacing back and forth, and you can tell they're highly agitated, and it's like, okay, then I know from that context, from the cues that I'm getting, this is empathic, right? I know the context. I recognize the context. So that's number one, because then you kind of know the breakdown of what needs to happen next. And so as soon as you realize you're in an empathic listening kind of situation, then you want to understand that your role here is to help them cope with or to solve a problem. And coping with it might be either one of these might be by providing input, or it might be, just listening. And sometimes once I've done this, when I've gone to vent, or even when I've gone actively to seek help, from my wife, I will do this all the time. I'll explain this situation, and as I'm explaining it, the solution unfolds out of my own mind while I'm walking through this thing that I'm so mad about. And I'm like, oh, I'm good. I got it figured out. And so even just like being there to be the vent for them, that's helping them to cope and solve a problem, as much as you might not think it is. But that's why it's important to seek to understand the needs, right? Do you need input? Like, are you open to input, or do you just want me to listen? And that's, like I said, that's more than acceptable. That is highly desirable. So the next part of this is, after you get that information, they're going to start talking again, right? And so you want to acknowledge and validate the emotions that they're feeling. And so this isn't to say that you're validating their thought process, or that you're validating, what their belief about the situation or the other person. There's so much that you don't know, and you should not be in that realm trying to troubleshoot from that angle. It should be more along the lines of, I can tell that you're really upset about this. Like, what about that really made you angry? Even if you those are good questions to have, like, what about that, da 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 da. Those are really good approaches to these kinds of conversations, even if you think, and even if it seems pretty obvious what it is. It's really good to do that, because it allows them to express that kind of deeper level, and it helps them kind of get to the root of what the emotional problem is, and that can help to solve the problem as well. We're getting really psychological here today, guys. Like it, love it, or hate it. That's where we're at right now. And then if they get to a point where they pause, or when they get to a point when they finally vented and they get to the point, and you can tell there's usually like a sigh, like, and they'll sit down, maybe they slump their shoulders a little bit, and they'll look down, head in hands, something like there's physical cues in place that let you know that they have reached the point when, the kind of verbal diarrheaing is complete. If they already extended to you that they are interested in your input, this is a great time to do it. And it's a way for you to just offer another perspective, another way of thinking about this. Like, oh, did you ever think of, like, you got home from work, let's say it's like a family situation, they're really upset with what's going on in their marriage, and you find out that, they get home from work after working all day, they get up at 5 a.m, they do this thing, they commute to work, they bust their hump all day, and they come home, and then the house is a mess, and, the kids are running around like crazy, and they're like, what's going on? Like, I want peace when I come home, and this is not peace, and then it turns into this fight. So you can offer another way to think about this by offering the perspective of the other side of, well, like they're home all day, they never get to leave, and they're stuck there. And so do you ever think about how frustrating it is for them, kind of a thing? But not to, again, you don't want to like make the argument for the other person, but you just want to find ways to give them another perspective, another way of thinking that might provide them a route to an aha moment, so to speak. So with those kind of strategies in place from the empathic listening perspective, or context, I should say, this is a really good segue into the next portion of the show, right? And so we said we were going to do how to listen effectively. And so when we're talking about this, there's essentially 3 different key components that I want to cover with this, and how to actually listen. You might think, I listen all the time. I know what listening is. This is dumb. I'm going to skip to the next chapter. Listen, that's an option, but there's a difference between hearing and listening, right? I don't know if you guys have seen White Men Can't Jump. I actually don't remember which perspective they were taking. I need to go back and watch that, watch that clip of the movie. It's so good. What a good movie. But anyway, there's a part in it when they're talking about listening and hearing and how they're doing one and not the other. Like, oh, it was about Jimi Hendrix, and it was like, you listen to Jimmy, but you don't hear him, or it was one way or the other. At any rate, the point that we're getting at here, to me, and the way that we're going to discuss this, is that listening is actually paying attention to and processing information. You know, when I'm hearing something, I can just hear something in the background and I don't process it. You know, I just heard a truck go by, and if it was going by and I hadn't taken that short little pause, then I might have heard it but not actually processed it, or I processed it very quickly. It doesn't matter. And the point is, listening, effective listening here when it comes to the person, is you're going beyond just hearing the sounds. Like, you're not just checking your ears to see that they work. It's you're actually paying attention. And that's the first component of this, is pay attention. Mind-boggling stuff, I know. So the part that you don't typically hear or get when someone's talking about paying attention is that you want to show it. So how do you show that you're paying attention? Well, you show that you're paying attention through multiple different perspectives, like body language. Are you looking at the computer, like we talked about the scenario earlier, where somebody walks into your office and you're still typing on your computer, like, yeah, go ahead. And you're still typing and you're kind of doing this glancing back and forth thing, or maybe you're not even looking at them ever. And you're just like, And so the reason that we do that is because even if we haven't had this explicitly made clear to us, like I am making clear to you right now, then we still know on an instinctual human level that there are cues, there are conversational cues and acknowledgments that you're paying attention, and nodding your head and saying is one of them. But that's faking it. Like you're putting it out there like, yes, I'm really listening, and I'm doing this because I want you to know that I'm listening, although I'm not, because I'm looking at my computer. And so I'm still gonna have to go back and ask you what in the world you were talking about, because I didn't listen. I heard you, but I didn't listen to you. So you want to take a pause, either tell them in that situation, right? You want to be able to tell them like, hey, you know what? I'm in the middle of this email. Give me like 10 minutes to finish writing this up, or however long, 5, 30, whatever it is. Just give me a minute while I finish this up. And so that because I want to give you my undivided attention. And they're like, oh, that's totally fine. Or they might say, this is an emergency. My office is on fire. Like, holy smokes. Okay, cool. And so you could even ask them. You could start it that way. Like, is this super pressing? I'm in the middle of the email and I just need to finish this. Give me 5 minutes if you can. And then most likely they'll say yes, lest the building be on fire. And then they feel acknowledged because you actually stopped what you were doing. You weren't even doing it like, hey, give me 2 minutes. That's fine, but it's kind of dismissive. When you give that pause, you engage, you look away, your physical body moves, right? So, because for me, I have a standing desk in my office. So I'm usually like this, standing up. Not standing up right now. And somebody will come in and they're not directly in my line of view. So I have to turn, or I have to physically move out of the way of my monitors that are in the way of the doorway. So I have to physically move so I can make eye contact with them. And that shows that I'm stopping what I'm doing and I'm giving you my attention. I'm showing you that I'm giving you my attention, making eye contact, right? The physical movements. And those are some of the ways. Again, even add in the not, yep, okay, yeah, totally. Those are great if you're there, right? Don't try to cheat the system because it doesn't work. Okay. So the next component of how to listen effectively is actually providing feedback. And so this doesn't mean, it's not feedback in the sense of like criticism or adjusting what they're saying, or, criticize. Like, it's not corrective. It's not that kind of feedback. It's not like, hey, can you review this paper? Or can you review this email and give me some feedback? Like, I just sent my last video out to some friends, and I was like, hey, can you give me some feedback on the first 60 seconds and just tell me how it worked? So then I got some feedback, and they gave, so that's different, right? That's not what we're talking about here. It's like a reciprocal communication. And so, and to let them know that you're listening. And so when somebody comes into your office, or you're having a meeting, and let's say you have a meeting and there are different people representing the different departments, and each department has a task in this, let's call it a working group. So you have this working group, it's working towards a project. You have a representative from each department that is required to be there in order to fulfill this project. You want to make sure that people are listening. So this is kind of skipping ahead. So, but if you are on the receiving side, if you are one of those departmental representatives, maybe you're the sales person who's there, and you want to make sure that the perspective of the sales is being heard, and that you understand what the key takeaways are for this particular project, or manufacturing, logistics, doesn't matter. When they're talking about your piece and they ask like, all right, any questions, or like, you got it? It is really helpful if you are kind of paraphrasing back. Okay, yeah, so it looks like our responsibilities are, we need to sell, X 10,000, X, tens of thousands of dollars, per week for the next, a quarter. And that's what we need from us on here. In order to do that, it looks like we're going to need to staff at this level, and we're going to need to rotate like this. Does that all sound right? And they're like, yep, that's exactly what we need. Okay, cool. Next. And so that, then you're ensuring that you truly understand, because you want to know that what they've put out, that you are actually receiving, but it also lets them know, gives them that sense of, oh, thank goodness, like, this person really paid attention, and they actually like, they understood. Because you can say something and somebody might not, and it might not click, and we're going to talk about that later in barriers to communication. So, but that's a conversation for another episode. But yeah, so you want, the paraphrasing is one way. Another way is clarifying questions, right? So maybe you don't like, okay, so when you were talking about this amount of sales, like, that sounds like we're going to need more people. Is that what you meant? And they're like, yeah, you have to pull from these other teams. Oh, okay. So I need to go talk to the other team leaders and see if I can get a couple of their people for, a week at a time over there. Like, yep, that's exactly right. Okay, cool. Now I know, because I asked clarifying questions, and then they know through that engagement you were engaged, and you understand what in the world was actually going on. So very helpful. And it builds that connection, builds that bond, right? Because that's the whole point. We're building stronger relationships. We're building a more robust culture within our organization, and we're doing it through simple listening skills, how to listen. So finally, the third one, this is really easy, because the first two are kind of active, right? So you're paying attention, right? You want to physically do something to pay attention. There are cues that you want to give to show that you're paying attention. The next one's provide feedback, right? Paraphrase or ask clarifying questions, right? These are, action-oriented tasks. This one should be easy to remember, because it's don't do something. It's don't interrupt. If somebody is speaking, let them speak. Like, I can acknowledge my own faults. I'm terrible at this. And part of it is rooted in, a significant portion of this is rooted in, I know I'm going to forget if I don't say what I need to say right away. And I will write it down if I'm in a position where I have like pen and paper. But a lot of times I'm not. So I find myself interrupting. And that's something I have to improve on, because it challenges the relationship, and it can get people frustrated, especially when you do it all the time. And then you can start to see it. Like if you're paying attention while you're speaking, then you're going to notice that they get kind of like exasperated or exhausted by your actions. They're just like, oh my God, here we go. Again, the 5th time in this conversation, you took over and you're just running with it. So don't interrupt, right? So the 3 portions of, or the 3 key elements here for how to effectively listen are paying attention and showing it, right? Providing feedback through paraphrasing or asking clarifying questions, and don't interrupt. Like, shut up, listen, nod, smile, listen. That's part of that's listening for you. And on that note, it's a really good way to end that one as we segue into the next section of the show here, and that is the secret sauce portion, right? This is like pro level stuff. This is listening while you speak. And so we've hit on a couple of these points to a certain degree throughout, because listening is so reciprocal, and it can bounce back and forth conversationally, and you could be in the center or receiver position, depending on the circumstance. So it's important to know both sides. So, I hope that you paid attention to this episode so far through that lens of being both a speaker and a receiver. This is very specifically from the speaker side, right? So we're kind of shifting our role, and with our sender hat, our speaker hat on, we also want to kind of tilt it a little bit sideways and, angle it slightly towards that receiver end too. And this is how you do it. Think of this from the perspective of like you're up on stage and speaking, or you're in a meeting and you're speaking to more than one person. And it even can be an individual, but it's easier that way because it's just one person. It's not many to pay attention. But this works for both the individual level and for groups. So you just have to scan and get a feel of what's going on when there are multiple people there. But what we're looking at are things like physical movement from the receiver side. Like, are they moving around? Are they shifting in their seat? Are they looking at their watch? Are they, do they seem antsy? Are they distractible? In a group, like, are they messing with their phones? There's a little side chatter going on. Those kinds of components are indicators that they're not engaged and they're not listening. Reverse that, and when physical movement is kind of subsided and they're sitting with like shoulders square towards you, there's not much side chatter, there's not a lot of distractions, you don't see a lot of phones moving. Their eye movement is like tracking you, especially if you're on stage and you're moving around. But if you're there, like the eye contact then is really good, between you and that one other person. Head nods are huge indicators, especially in a crowd, but even in the person, like, yep, totally get it. All of those things. Those are again, from the speaker side, those are things you want to be paying attention to, that someone's actually engaged with you. Now, if those things went off the rails, like we had talked about kind of in the beginning, where the eye movement, they're kind of darting around, they're not really looking at you, maybe they're not head nodding, maybe they look distracted or bored or whatever, you can recapture attention with things called pattern interrupts. So what happens is, like here, you would have noticed in the episode that there would have been jump cuts. I don't know if that's what they're actually called. Maybe. Who knows? Doesn't matter. But it's like when I cut from like this standard size screen of me and it jumps into like a little zoomed in version, and maybe if there's another point shortly after, it jumps into another zoomed version of that. That is those are pattern interrupts. It's like, oh, something changed. Oh, something like that wasn't expected, and it re-attracts your focus to what's going on. It's another thing that happens. This is how YouTube works, and this is even you can do this just verbally, and so it impacts the podcast side as well. But on the YouTube side, the visual side, that's when words pop up, or different screens or pictures or images that you've seen. When those pop up, those are pattern interrupts. When it shifts to black and white, that's a pattern interrupt. All of those things, it's to re-engage and to keep you fixated and focused and not losing your attention, or the sender not losing their grasp on your attention. That's the whole point. We want you to watch. and one of the ways that I like to grab and keep attention is by providing value. So if you found this valuable, please like, please comment. I don't even care if you subscribe. That'd be cool. But commenting would be great. Let me know what you guys think. I'm truly, genuinely curious. And if you comment, I guarantee you I'm going to respond. So I'm here. I'm like a real person on the other side. I promise. So at any rate, the other ways, like when you're trying to invoke pattern interrupts, or, just more simply, if you're trying to re-engage people that are not there, then you want to break the pattern of expectations. That's what interrupting the pattern means, is that if you have a slideshow and you're presenting, let's say you're doing it in person. This is really great. You have a slideshow and you're presenting, and then all of a sudden you get to a slide and you turn it off, but it's obviously not the end of the slideshow. You turn it off, and then you go walk to the other side of the room, and then you give an example of something by taking a person that's there and like, you're this person and I'm this person and this is how we interact. Like if I use them as an example of the person that walks into my office. You walk into my office and you're telling me this, and you don't even have to have them ask or say anything, but you use a person as a prop kind of a thing. Like you say that you're the person that walks into my office and I'm over here typing on my computer. What are you going to think if I keep typing and I tell you, go ahead and keep talking to me? Right? That kind of goes into the next option of pattern interrupt, and ones that even work on podcasts and shows like this, is ask questions. And so if I'm going and I'm giving you this information, I'm telling you, and we're having a good time, and you're like, yeah, okay, I'm good. And then, life is happening around you, you're doing dishes, or, you're going for a run, whatever the case may be. If I give a pause and I ask a question and I pause, then it's a pattern error. You're like, oh, I'm like, it automatically draws you in, because when for some reason, the way that our minds work, when we hear a question, we feel compelled to answer it. Even when we have a question in our own minds, our minds will generate an answer, which is why it's really important. This is a whole other topic that could be another series in and of itself, but the power of asking the right questions to yourself is huge because of that exact tendency, because you are going to answer that question, right? That's critical. So that's another way to do it. Ask questions. Again, take long pauses, physically move around. All of these components are different ways to conduct pattern interrupts. And there's 1,000 more, and you can look them up. Now listen, this is super important, and it's actually required if you desire to forge stronger bonds that are actually going to last through the thick and the thin, helping you to strengthen your organizational culture. It's just, that's what it is. We're people. People demand connection. In order to connect, we have to communicate. And if you want people to connect with you, you have to listen. You have to know how to listen. And it's not just hearing the words. This is huge. But the thing is, now we're operating in different spaces. Our workplaces are evolving, and we're seeing more remote, or at least hybrid, types of interactions, which can be very different than this in-person interactions that we've been talking about. Even if you're in the office full time, there's still a massive amount of communication that we send, via digital means, emails to clients, to colleagues. We have virtual events, we had webinars, we have, we text messages, there's Slack groups. All of these things are different forms, written, maybe a written evaluation, or, like I've had to handwrite several things in the past week alone, just because of, that's just the way that it worked. And, for like professionally, and it was super surprising. Like, who writes things like pens? I have so many pens, and I never thought I'd use them so much. I like it. At any rate, now that you have the necessary essentials for effective in-person communication, you're definitely going to want to check out the other than verbal communication, right? The written and the typed and all of the digital communications that are out there. You want to understand what the impact of using those are in your communication in the workplace. Like, what's the right time? What's the right context? We're going to dive into all of that in the next video. So I will see you guys later.